Hey, welcome to Mooney Reads. My name is Beck, and today I'm going to be talking about the stay-at-home reading rush and the books that I decided to read for that. The stay-at-home reading rush was a challenge put together by the Reading Rush, which is an already established readathon. They usually have a larger readathon, I think in the summer, so this was just a smaller spring one. This was a 4-day readathon, so it was pretty quick. So I'll talk about each of the prompts and the books that I decided to read for them. The first prompt was to read a book with a house on the cover. This one I did not actually get to. I did plan to read A Cup of Water Under My Bed by Daisy Hernandez, which is a memoir. I just didn't end up getting to it in the 4 days that I had. I do plan on reading it at some point, though. I saw Daisy Hernandez speak at a Women's and Gender Studies conference, and she seems really awesome. I also use Colonize This, which is a book that she edited with Bushra Rehman on women of color and their feminism. So I'm really interested in her memoir, just didn't end up getting to it. The next prompt was to read a book in the same room the whole time. And the book that I ended up reading, all in the same room, was Greta Thunberg's No One Is Too Small to Make a Difference. This is a collection of her speeches that she's made at various places. At the beginning of each one, it tells you where she was and the date, and all of these are from late 2018 to late 2019. If you don't know, Greta Thunberg is a climate activist. She advocates for everybody, but especially companies and politicians, to do what we need to do to make climate change stop happening at the rate that it is. She basically advocates to listen to scientists so that the world doesn't end up being a terrible place in just a matter of a decade or less. And she started being interested in climate, or really worried about the sort of thing that it would do, starting when she was like 8. She actually started a school strike a little bit later, and that's one of the things that she got known for. She wasn't necessarily supported by her parents or anything. She just did this because she saw that it was a problem, and she is worried for herself and everybody else who's in the younger generations. I really enjoyed a lot of these speeches. Obviously, some of it was repetitive because she is making the same point just to multiple audiences. But it was really incredible to hear someone who was 15 and then 16, I believe, talking about all of these points. And whenever I see stuff like this where it's like children advocating for something, it makes me sort of hopeful for the future on one hand, because I know that like when I was that age, I didn't really know much about anything. I think I was interested in like banned books, and I thought that banning books was wrong, but I didn't get the whole thing, and there were so many ways where I did not understand some very basic things. But the grasp that she seems to have on this, she doesn't just say, oh, this is a problem and we need to listen to scientists, even though that is the crux of the majority of her argument, which seems pretty simple. She also talks about the fact that with this climate crisis also comes inequity within the climate crisis, the fact that the people who contributed to the carbon monoxide and methane gas rising and using fossil fuels, the people who do that least end up having to see the impact of climate change more quickly than anybody else and with more intensity. So she addresses kind of the inequity of climate change, but she also talks about the fact that there's a really big piece of culture that's perpetuating this. Like the reason that we don't have these policies and that people don't want to look at the issues and don't want to fully understand them is the fact that getting as much as you possibly can is sort of built into the culture that we've created. She doesn't say in those exact words that, you know, it's capitalism, but that's what you get from it. And it's just amazing that somebody her age would be able, or would end up coming to that conclusion, or at the very least from my perspective. Granted, I'm from Tennessee, so like not a whole lot of people, I guess, over here were thinking about that. So while it is hopeful that, you know, they're kind of thinking ahead, it's also devastating, honestly, that they're having to think about this. And the reason that she goes through and she talks about all this is because she's scared, she's worried. She talks about, you know, everybody should be in a panic, in a useful panic. And since nobody else is, she is, and other people, a lot of whom are younger and climate activists, have to be too. So most of what she's saying is based off of various scientific facts. She even refers to specific studies and things like that. So you get that scientific piece, but there's also this palpable sense of anger, righteous anger, that, again, there's this sense of hope, but also this kind of devastating sense that somebody, especially from such a young age, has to engage in that, in those sort of emotions. I also found that piece of it very relatable, I think. I don't like being angry, and I have a tendency to push those sort of emotions away. But when it comes to various things that are related to social problems, especially, with the specific stuff that I've looked at, it's been LGBT studies, it's been especially looking at, the trans experience and how people are treated. And feeling that anger, especially when you feel like nobody else is engaging in the appropriate amount of anger, the way that feels is really hard to describe, and the sadness that's kind of inherent in that sort of anger. And that's what a lot of the things that she said reminded me of, or I guess the emotion that I got from the book reminded me of. So I got a lot out of this book. I think that Greta Thunberg as an activist is an interesting person, and I think that it also says a lot about kind of the world and where it's at this point. It also has me looking forward to reading the few climate-related books that I got an ebook last month. The next prompt was to read a book set somewhere you wished to go. And the book that I chose for that was Nevada by Imogen Binnie, and the place that I was thinking of when I picked up this book actually was not Nevada. I honestly don't know very much about Nevada. I don't have strong opinions. I've never been to it. However, if you look at the back of the book, the main character is in New York, at the very least in the beginning. And for the bulk of the book is set in New York. The last, maybe third of the book isn't. This was a really interesting read. There are a lot of intricate elements in the book that I think are related to the main character and how you're, not only how you're supposed to understand her, but how she understands herself. Honestly, this gave me kind of Catcher in the Rye vibes. It's very focused on the character. There is more plot in this book than in Catcher in the Rye, and it's not directly comparable in some ways, and I don't want anybody's expectations to be set really high or I guess really low if you don't like Catcher in the Rye. Although, honestly, if you didn't like Catcher in the Rye, you probably wouldn't like this book, unless the reason that you didn't like Catcher in the Rye was that it was assigned to you. In which case, you should reread Catcher in the Rye and also read this book. But they're similar in that I think that both books are saying something about the characters and something sort of about human nature in general, kind of coming of age, although Catcher in the Rye is more focused on an adolescent. The character in this book is about 30 or so. So she's gotten past adolescence and understands herself to a certain point. The main character is a trans woman. She is already living in the city. She's past the sort of coming out and whatever. But she very clearly is having kind of a life crisis and realizing how little she understands herself. But with all of the stuff that you learn about her and her character, I think not only do you get it from just what you have from her, but the whole kind of means of storytelling lends itself to understanding these sort of things about her. This book is written in third person, but it's third person limited for the most part. Sometimes it will focus on other characters, but the majority of the book focuses on Maria. And throughout it, you do get kind of this conflicted message of who she is as a character. You get the idea that she has made sacrifices for people, but you also see a whole lot of selfishness. Similarly, you can see kind of some of her values being conflicting. Even in her image, there's kind of an understanding of some sort of like punk vibes, but that doesn't carry through to everything, even though I think she thinks that it should or does in a certain degree. Another interesting decision within this too is that they don't really use quotation marks when they're having conversations. And throughout the book, you also, especially I think towards the end, rather than saying Maria said this, it'll say Maria was like, and then have the rest of the phrase. So it's kind of conversational. And there are other elements that make it sound sort of conversational. And that was an interesting choice. And I almost wondered in part of the book, and honestly this could have been because of a typo, it's kind of hard to say if it was intentional or not. I also wonder if this book was supposed to be, at least mostly, narrated by Maria, even though it's in third person. Maybe I'm kind of going out there a little bit, but that's sort of the vibe that I got for some of it, and would also make sense of some of the contradictions and understanding her character. Really, Maria being the narrator, talking in third person, would make sense because, like I said, a lot of the story is that she doesn't know who she is. Additionally, they do talk a decent amount about dissociation. Regardless of whatever literary or characterization choice dissociation might have impacted, I do think that it was intentionally included as a part of kind of a discussion on gender that gets left out, and I think that that's really important that they decided to include that. It's something that I personally relate to. You don't really get to hear a lot about dissociation, or at least for me it took a long time to understand that I was experiencing it or what it meant or anything like that. So the fact that they do discuss it and incorporate it into this book is really important all by itself as well. They talk about it in relation to, you know, how she feels about her body in terms of gender, but also just how she can relate to herself because of how she grew up, not fitting the gender that she was supposed to, and even outside of that, some of the choices that she had to make. Throughout it, she ends up talking about how she's done these different things. She's sacrificed a number of things, or she has acted in certain ways because it's what she thought that other people has wanted from her. And that focus on what other people want has outweighed a lot of actual decisions that she would end up making. And she's realizing that she doesn't understand who she is at all. And all of that is super relatable for me. But on, you know, in the same token that she has been acting for other people, she's also a pretty selfish person. And it gets to kind of a ridiculous point, especially towards the end of the book. But it's interesting how both of those things can be true at the same time, because even if you are making decisions based on what other people are feeling, that seems like an unselfish thing to do, but there can be a certain amount of selfishness in avoiding conflict. Maybe this is just more me meditating on myself rather than the character, because she is also very outwardly selfish in other ways too, again, especially towards the end. Now, I did think this book was really brilliant. It was absolutely fascinating, but I do think that there were some points for improvement, or some things that I wasn't really sure about. Really, I thought the first part of the book, which is probably the first 2/3, was a lot stronger than the second part. In the second part, you get introduced to a new character, and I think that it could have been done better, especially if it had been a little bit longer, because she goes into these almost monologues when she's with this character, and they're important pieces of conversations on like what it means to be trans, and you get some of those throughout the whole book. You get a whole lot about like how she relates to her body. Like I said, they talk about like dissociation and things like that. And then the second part, it talks about some more problematic frameworks that people have come up with that don't actually make sense and sort of perpetuate not only transphobia and transmisogyny, but they come from just plain old misogyny. And I think that that's important to talk about, but I don't think that it was done as successfully as it could have been done. I also think that the ending was maybe a little bit too open. I understand the need for a book like this to have an open ending, but I think that in introducing that other character, they could have done maybe a little bit more than they actually did. Regardless, I think this was a very interesting book. This is one that I would definitely read again with even more intention and more critically looking at it. Honestly, reading it beside Catcher in the Rye might even be interesting. It might be nothing. You know, it could just be me being weird. But I think that it could potentially be an interesting look in a characterization and how using somebody's perspective of themselves can say something more about kind of the human condition in general. Maybe I'll do that at some point, maybe I won't. But this was a very interesting book. It's definitely not for everybody, just like Catcher in the Rye isn't for everybody. There are some people who really detest it because they like plot-driven things. So if you're somebody who doesn't like kind of literally weird books, maybe don't pick this up. But if you're interested in engaging in something that's a little bit more weird, definitely character-focused, character-driven, definitely go with it. If you like stories that are a little bit more cut and dry or follow kind of a typical format, maybe don't go into this. But I had a lot of fun with it, and I would like to read it again. And the final prompt for the stay-at-home reading rush was to read a book that will make you smile. And for this, I actually chose to read fan fiction. I don't know if that's really allowed. Is there some kind of readathon taboo with that? I don't know. I was already planning on reading through old fan fictions that were some of my favorites in middle school and early high school for a reading vlog. So I just decided to add that to this. I didn't read all of it because I started it a little bit before the reading challenge and I still have a couple chapters left. But I read the majority of An Aversion to Change, which was on MuggleNut Fanfiction. It's a Draco Hermione fic. So Dramione, which was one of my main ships back then, not really something I look at so much now. And it actually wasn't so bad. It definitely did make me smile because thinking back on how I would read a lot of this, and I wasn't as critical and really wasn't as knowledgeable about a lot. There are definitely holes in the characterization, but there are also kind of classic holes that are in the characterization. This is also a fic that has some of like the Dramione staples. Has the head boy, head girl trope where they have to share a common room. It has a masquerade ball. So it's pretty classic in those ways, but they do add another interesting element to it by including an original character. I think for nostalgic value, it was good. But as far as characterization goes, there are a lot of decisions that are made that are out of character. In some of it, Draco's a little bit too mean, and there's a lot that's like questionable so far as relationship dynamics go, which can definitely be a problem in certain Dramione fics, which is why I say, you know, they're like classic characterizations, or some of the decisions that they make are ones that aren't uncommon in Dramiones, at least Dramiones of the time. I don't know what things looked like after like 2009, honestly. So there are definitely some problems in it, but for its time, it's pretty decent. I don't know, I wouldn't really recommend it now just because some of the relationship dynamics are questionable. Also, the way that Hermione is characterized is very scared. There's definitely like some sexism in there that needs to be worked out. But it's been fun to reread and fun to kind of remember the story, because there were parts of it that like I think I know how this is going to happen, but I wasn't totally sure, and then like remembering it as the story progresses is really fun. So yeah, those are the 4 writing prompts and what I read for them. I also participated in the Instagram challenges that they put up, so if you want to see my pictures for those, you can check out my Instagram. If you participated in the stay-at-home reading rush, let me know what you read and what you thought about them. If you're participating in any other readathons, let me know. I know there's a whole lot going on right now. Thank you all so much for watching. Bye.